these days, as opposed to in the past, it's actually cool to be the bass player.
People ask me why did I choose bass, and me and a few of my other compatriots would probably say we didn't choose the bass, it kind of chose us. I mean, it chose me.
You know, bass players, we haven't been out there in the front for very long in terms of music. You know, we haven't been out there vying for the, you know, that lead spot and taking the solo. We're so used to standing in the background and being the parent, supporting the kids, letting them run around and do their thing.
The sound of music today is this low end, huge. I mean, your cars driving down the street and hear the whole house shaking from the low end thing. That came from the fact that now we can turn the bass up. I mean, it didn't come directly from it. It was a long, involved evolution. But the whole idea is now you can have bass through a speaker loud. And, you know, that started to change the way things were.
One of the things I love about playing bass is it's standing in front of my amp and you just feel it on your butt, just boop, 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 boop. You know, just like, it makes you want to shake your ass, you know? Or it'll do it for you if you don't, you know?
This has got more names than any other instrument I can possibly think of, and I'll just try to recite out of memory right now. Okay, there's the acoustic bass, there's the upright bass, there's the string bass, there's the double bass. Did I say acoustic bass? Yes, I said acoustic bass. There's the doghouse bass. There's the contrabass, that's German. There's, did I say stand-up? Upright, there's upright bass, stand-up bass. Anyway, a lot of names for this thing. I kind of like doghouse bass the best.
I don't know, it's just one of those instruments that kind of put a smile on people's faces. And I mean, carrying this thing through the airport, man, it's like being the Pied Piper. I got to say, you carry this thing through and you got kids pointing and looking and following you around. I mean, it's, you know, it's just, it's a sound that really reaches deep into people.
I mean, bass players are obviously the coolest people there are. You know, I mean, you look at the singers, and you know what they're going to be like. You know, the head cases and the guitar players are going to be, you know, obsessed with minutia and, you know, kind of guys. And the drummers, well, we all know about drummers. So, bass players are just the kind of cool guys that stand back there and smile and hold it all together.
That's the beauty of playing, because today is not the last gig I'm ever going to do. Hopefully, tomorrow isn't the last gig I'm going to do. Hopefully, so the subsequent days that are in my future, I can do it better, differently, improve upon it, and try to do something that means something personally to me, and then invite people to share the experience.
If you really want to play and you really think that you got it together, get your acts together, get it together, go jam. Little by little, things happen accidentally, but you better have your playing together. You never know where the break's going to come.
As a kid, I was a violinist because I had an ability in music that was natural. So being that my father had a background in opera, he introduced me to the violin as an instrument to help, I guess, cultivate my musicality. So I was a serious violin student for something like 10 years. And then wanted to quit it because it didn't satisfy me anymore. In fact, I didn't want to play anything anymore. But I found that that was like an impossibility. And that's when it became clear to me that I really had to play. If I wasn't going to play violin, I had to play something. And I eventually decided to become a bass player. The decision was the most profound and greatest decision I've ever made for myself, because it's the singular, I guess, accomplishment that I've undertaken that I've still maintained as a daily focus, maybe for nearly 30 years, over 30 years.
I saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, and everything was different. The next day at school, everything looked different, everything sounded different. You know, seeing all the girls scream for the Beatles was probably one of the most motivational moments for musicians that ever happened, because everybody that had enough smarts to figure it out looked at that and said, hey, if I did that, maybe that would happen to me. So it was kind of what I had done. As soon as I saw that, my sister had a folk guitar, and she was into Donovan and Marianne Faithfull and people like that. And so I sneak into her room and borrow that and figure out where the notes were on the thing and stuff. But it was kind of how I got introduced to it, pretty much.
I was 11 years old, and I was in the Boy Scouts in Harlem. And the scoutmaster was into West Montgomery. And in Harlem, he didn't have many other musicians to play with at that time. So he asked, after the meetings, would I go to his house, you know, and would I accompany him on guitar? So I said, well, yeah, why not? You know, something to do, and we'd have fun, because I come down from the Bronx to Harlem, so it was a pretty nice, hefty train ride. So we'd start playing West and this and that, and of course, I didn't know anything how to play, and I would always gravitate to the notes. So his name was Leon Charlie, and then he got me going. And from there, we started playing after-hour places. For those of you who don't know what that is, it was clubs that were illegally open after hours, and that's how I cut my teeth.
I can't even remember what brought me first to music. I know my mom had a piano at the house, and she used to play hymns and stuff like that, and still does, on the piano by ear. And but I just took piano lessons, and then wanted to be in the high school band, and they needed trombone players. So, next thing I know, there's a guy at school saying, you know, we need a bass player in the band. Do you want to play bass? And I'd been playing trombone, and I said, well, maybe. And next thing I know, I'm playing. I remember I was in the high school band, and I go to my band director and say, I can't make the high school football game, which the band always played on Friday night. And he said, why not? And I said, well, I've got a gig. And he says, a gig? And I go, yeah, I'm playing electric bass, and I've got a gig for Friday night. And I go, it pays $50. And he goes, he was a trombone player. He goes, heck, do they need a trombone player? So that was the end of my high school band career. It was just $50, and it's all over. And back in the late 70s, $50 would really get you somewhere.
Well, I was always involved in music. My father is a music professor. My mother was an opera singer, and my oldest brother played guitar. And so I was always just exposed to all different kinds of music, from pop to jazz to classical, from a very early age. There was always guitars and dulcimers and auto harps lying around the house, and kalimbas, and just, you know, lots of music around the Ham household. So I started out playing piano at a very early age. Beyond that, I do remember going to Eisner Park in Champaign, Illinois, and they had a rock band set up out on the playing there, and the bass player had one of those orange Sun amps, you know, with like the plush thing, and he had a white curly cord from his bass to his amp, and I just thought that was really cool, so I wanted to play bass.
I had picked up dance along the way somehow around 14, and was doing classical, like ballet and stuff, and I really wanted to do that for a living. I mean, that's what I wanted to do with my life. And I ended up having to stop because of my knees. And I got this thing called Osgood Slatters, which most teenagers get. And I was very, very depressed about that. And I started playing my brother's electric bass after school with all this free time I had, just kind of this therapy. So by the time I got to high school, I was always playing with my older brother and his friends who could really play. You know, I couldn't play yet. I could play with those rock guys, you know, but I was still huffing and puffing trying to catch up with them, you know. And right out of high school, I started playing professionally. I skipped college. Only kid in my family to not go to college, much to my parents' dismay.
I had a brother, he's not living anymore, and he was getting into folk music. And he had bought a Martin guitar, and he was starting to play. And he's kind of the one that got me into it. I suddenly, well, before that, I played piano, he played drums, but when he started playing guitar, and it went to an acoustic type of format, then I had to think about something else, and I thought, well, the bass is something I always wanted to play. Maybe I'll rent one and try it out and see how I do on it, because I just felt that I could play it. For some reason, I knew I could play it. And some weeks later, there was a party at my brother's house, an outdoor backyard picking party, so to speak. And somebody showed up with a acoustic bass. And I said, let me try that. And I tried it, and I bought that same bass a week later for $125. And I was playing bass.
My first bass guitar was a Univox. It was a copy of a Hofner violin, you know, beetle-shaped bass. And you can see it on the cover of my What Did He Say album. I have it strapped down my back. That's my first bass. It's a real small bass, and it was taller than I was when I got it. So.
This one guy was moving, he needed some money, and he was selling off all of his things, and he gave me some cheesy Zimgar bass for $10, and that's when I got my first bass.
And it was $17. It was a Decca brand, D-E-C-C-A, just like the old record company. And I've since found out that Aria, who I currently endorse, was the maker of Decca. So the bass, you know, I started out technically on the same brand that I'm playing now. But I should say that this Decca had frets up until the 8th fret. And then it was, somebody pulled the frets out above that, and I just thought it was a deformity. So I would play up there, not really understanding that I was playing fretless bass at the time.
First bass guitar was a big red one. I believe it was an Alvarez that my parents got for me for Christmas in 1973 from a pawn shop in Champaign, Illinois. It was also the first Christmas present that I ever reached around in their closet and reached in the little cardboard box it has and felt the strings, and I knew that it was a bass in there. And I put Spider-Man and Silver Surfer stickers all over it. I wish I still had it.
The bass player has to make the whole band sound good. That's your role.
Bass players, you know, more or less have to assume their role in a band. And most of the time, you're not going to take a solo on every song. Maybe 1 or 2 songs a night if you're lucky.
You know, to me, the bass is what it is. It's a bass guitar, and you know, it should be used accordingly. I don't all the time use it that way, but I admit.
But the general rule of what we do is not solo-oriented. The general rule for what we do is bass-oriented, is root-oriented, and you can go back in history and find out that most music is da 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 da. I mean, while somebody plays a melody, someone has got to play the root and a tonality representing the chord, which in this case is the 5. Now, there's nothing necessarily fancy about that, but if somebody had a virtuosic kind of approach to the instrument, might be able to play it, you know, and have another way of playing it, which might be slightly different, but still playing it root-oriented. You know, I mean, see if I can. You know, you have different ways of playing it. Maybe they won't be so mad at me for playing it this way, but they will be. You know, they're going to not want that because I'm not playing a root. I'm in all, you know, everybody's way. So really, the honest, probably best way to define what we do as musicians is to play a root. But how I do it is my style, and that's the beautiful thing about the individual musicians, as I demonstrated 3 ways that work and 1 way that probably didn't.
I've always heard things, you know, in terms of drums and in terms of lead, because of the types of basses that I was into, were very much lead bass players, from Larry Graham and Bootsy to Jocko Stanley and Alphonso Johnson, you know. But all those guys knew the role of the bass, you know. Now, being young, I was more concerned with the other stuff that they were doing. But, you know, that's part of the process. When you're young, you gotta get all that. You have to focus on that, you know. But now, the older I get, the more I focus on the role of the bass when I'm playing that role. Because on this bass, you know, a lot of times I play with a bass player and I don't play the role of the bass at all, ever.
Playing bass is really a great role for a woman, because a woman is a typical very, very good manager. You manage the house, you manage the kids, you manage this, you manage that. The bass is the manager of the band. You know, you put the framework around the band.
The function of the bass, what attracted it to me, is it unifies the rhythm and the melody and the chords, the harmonic content and the rhythmic content. So while you're keeping the pulse, you know, generally doubling what the bass, the kick drum's doing, or in a funk aspect, doubling what the kick and snare are doing, boom, ba-da, boom, boom, da. But then again, you're keeping that pulse going while moving the chords around. Like what's the right. And that's actually Forget-Me-Nots, not Men in Black, for you young kids out there, by Patrice Rushen. But so there you have where the bass has got the rhythm going, but it's also moving the chords around. So it's what unifies it. And that's why I said, well, if you're playing that, and then I go, that moves where the song is going, no matter what everyone else is playing, all right? So that's what the bass does. It holds it all together, you know. The unifying force, the bottom end.
My career started out, and every other bass player I know, no matter how pyrotechnical they are, no matter what they do, and no matter how over the top it is, 99.99% of them started out playing good, solid bass, and still do, and still a lot of times prefer to. But that's what a career will be built on. You know, they build all these beautiful houses in California, and once again, this is a beautiful house. But if an earthquake comes along and damages the foundation, or if it's built on a bad foundation, all that beautiful house is worthless, because they come in and they wreck it. They tear it down and they start all over again. And bass playing is like that. You know, if you build all this pretty stuff on top of a weak foundation, chances are you will be condemned.
The role can change because the person can change. You know, so my role changes throughout the night, especially on my solo gigs. You know, it's changing all the time. And that's what I love about playing music. You know, I don't want to just have to be able to do one thing. But I'll go back every time and say that as a bass player, I want to make sure I know the role of the bass first before I decide to change that role.
I don't think there's any one role for bass players to go for. It really depends on the music. I mean, if I'd look at things so cut and dry as this is solely what the bass does, I mean, if Jimi Hendrix looked at the guitar as this is what a guitar does, he never would have, you know, kicked the doors open and changed things so much.
The role of the bass is exactly what the band leader wishes it to be, or exactly what the solo artist bass player wishes it to be. And that's about as general a definition as I can pick, because if you do a jingle or a commercial, probably the role of the bass is a root, or playing behind a singer, Rosemary Clooney or Tom Jones. You're going to have to play the root of the song. These are the leaders and their band, let's say their orchestra, the conductor will tell you what it is you want to play. He'll give you a part, so that's the role of the bass. In a bass player's solo record, or in a specialized group, a group where 3 or 4 musicians or however many musicians congregate to play, the bass will change, I guess, what the meaning of the instrument is according to those 3 or 4 guys.
The rules are there are no rules. That's how we make progress. But the fundamental role of the bass is to support the band and keep that groove going. I always say the very first thing when I had the rare opportunity to play a little bit and record with Miles Davis, he always said, have ears bigger than your head. You know, always listen first. And then, so you have to listen. Your attitude is important, and mostly important is the groove. So you have to push that band. You are the middle of the band. So the drummer is playing mostly the rhythms, and your other instruments are playing chords, and they're playing all the melody. The bass is rhythm and melody. So it's the fundamental of both. That's your center point there. If the bass player sucks, excuse my French, the band ain't going nowhere. Drums and bass are the core of the band. Amen.
unfortunately, a lot of newer, younger musicians don't really research their roots like I would like to see them do, and that's one thing, you know, teaching at Bass Institute of Technology or any place I do a clinic, I try to go back and make people aware that like any other instrument or any other facet of life, there's a history and there's an evolution that leads up to this jumping off point.
It's very hard to trace the true lineage of the double bass as well as with the other string instruments. Many people feel the predecessor to the double bass was the violone. The violone was actually a bass viola da gamba. It had 6 strings and it was tuned in fourths and thirds. The violone was a fretted instrument and it was played standing up. Eventually, strings were dropped, and by the middle of the night, well, by the early 18th, 19th century, 4 strings were employed. Part of the difficult thing was that what was happening in Italy was different than what was happening in Germany and France also. When there was a 6-string violone in, let's say, Italy, in Germany there were 4- and 5-string basses. Originally, the bass instruments were part of what was called continuo. In Baroque music, the continuo is the bass line or the accompaniment. That was the role of the bass, kind of to fortify the left hand and the harmonies that the continuo player, the harpsichordist, was playing. This is all a part of the European tradition, what was happening in Europe. Certainly, music was a big part of the church, and so in the time of Bach, when he employed many musicians, they were playing mostly cantatas and church music, and you know, but there was also music in the home and lots of secular music also. But there was normally there was always some sort of bass instrument, whether it was the viola da gamba or a bass gamba that was actually doubling and playing the lower octave of the viola da gamba. So the role of the double bass through the 18th and 19th and early 20th century was mainly in the orchestra, and it would never be just one double bass. It was always many double basses. In a symphony orchestra of 100 players, you generally have 8 double bass players playing the same part. The bass obviously grew into and became popular in other idioms, such as jazz especially. Many people feel that jazz came out of classical music in a sense that, especially the bass lines were built on basically going back to continuo playing in the 17th century.
It found its way into jazz music. It replaced the tuba. And of course, by now we all know that jazz music was, started in the South, and it was born out of blacks with European band instruments. And at first it was just all horns and of course a marching drummer type setup, but they eventually got the drummer to sit down, and they got rid of the tuba, and they used an upright bass. But until Leo Fender came along with the electric bass, all the music that I could think of used acoustic bass. There's so many different styles you can play if you play one of these. I don't play any classical music, but a friend of mine, he plays in the symphony, and he also plays in a swing band, plays jazz gigs, and also plays some bluegrass music. And I play quite a few jazz gigs, a lot of bluegrass music, folk music, country music, blues. I do it all on the acoustic bass.
Besides anything but classical music, bass players have always fought how to amplify it and how to get a good sound on stage, especially as music got louder. And I've heard stories of a lot of the big band guys, which I know to be true, which happens to me also, just their fingers being bloody at the end of shows, trying to compete with that volume.
Rock and roll had to have the foundation of the electric guitar and the electric bass. It was guitar players, for the most part, that learned to play the bass in the beginning, because they could translate very easily in their mind those 4 strings on the bass from the guitar.
The big feud was when electric bass
came on the scene at all, you know, the upright players that doubled, you know, were kind of just like, you know, and then because the upright players felt like it was taking work from them, which it was. It was a different sound, you know.
The popularity of playing the upright bass really started to wane, even by the late 50s. There were some bands still bringing an upright bass out with them, but you know, with the invention of an electric bass, it changed a lot of things. So the electric bass became a real easy way to get a nice, clean, loud sound, which you couldn't really get out of an upright bass at the time.
It was fretted now, and you could articulate individual notes very loudly. Now it was unlimited. And I think that one step of fretting the instrument and amplifying it, those two steps, changed history as far as music goes.
Producers started calling for a Fender bass sound, a Fender bass sound. It's still listed in the Local 47 union book out there, Fender bass players. It doesn't make any difference what kind of electric bass you play. It's still a Fender bass to the studios because that was the first. And the preciseness of that, in that a tone was either on or it was off, a half step, made it very valuable to those who were trying to do things the right way.
We had a problem with the bass players because the people that played bass, you couldn't hear them with the electric guitar. And also the bass was a problem because those large hollow basses, stand-up basses, were hard to transport in rainy weather. How do you haul one of them? How do you get it to a bandstand? So Leo started telling me one day, he said, you know, I think we should build an electric bass, which I thought was a great idea also. So we started experimenting with electric basses. And we did the same way as we did on the guitar. There was nothing available. There wasn't such a thing as electric bass. So we started building it, and we created a body a little larger and a longer neck. And also the keys, we had to take keys that were made for those big upright basses and cut them down, cut the metal down to small size to create the keys for the strings. Then that brought us to another problem. Where would you get a string to work on the magnetic pickup? Because the early basses used what they referred to as catgut strings. So we looked at that and bought some of these different strings that were available. And to make those strings work on a magnetic pickup, right where it passed over the magnetic pole, we wrapped fine wire on those strings, real fine wrapping on it, maybe an inch or so, wrapped around this catgut string and glued it, cemented it on there, right in that magnetic field. Then it would pick up that magnetic field and create the sound. So our first basses, that's the kind of strings we made for them. But as soon as we found out that it was working, we contacted the string maker, and he came up soon with, and was able to make strings that would work on the electric bass. But this is the way our first ones were made. They had strings that we had to actually wind ourselves, wind the wrapping on them to make them work on the magnetic pickup. Everything was a trial and error kind of a thing. And the metal parts, we used to cut metal parts out by hand shape them, and try them until we found something that would work. There had never been a bass built with frets. So Leo decided, well, if you make frets on a neck, now a guitar player, the same notes as a guitar, the guitar player doesn't have to learn how to play because he already knows the notes. And also, it had to be accurate because you get that, so you could turn that volume up. That note had to be accurate on that bass as well as the guitar. And so there again, it went back to the thing. We had to have a longer neck, and the scale length worked out on where we placed these particular frets to get that sound. And now there was done again back to Leo's gal in the office and with her equipment, and she figured that out and laid us out a chart, which we used, and still using. I guess they still use that same chart.
between the guitar player and the drummer, they outplayed the bass, and that's the reason we came along with a solid body bass. The bass player had to be heard too. So we had to make a solid body bass, had to make an amplifier that would stand up under bass treatment, and then they could all be heard. And of course, not only the Western bands, but then the rock bands came along, and the louder they could play, the better they were. It didn't make any difference if they played well or not, as long as they played loud. Well, having built a solid body guitar and having it dominate the music that was being played, I mean, he could play as loud as anybody in the band, but the bass player couldn't, so it was just a natural progression into the bass field. Why can't we make a bass that has strings on it? Sure. So it was just a natural progression. There weren't any strings for it, there weren't anything for it in the early beginning. Nobody made those things. And to work the prototype and develop it and wrap some wire around some regular strings and bass strings and put it on there. So we had you know, some magnetic disturbance there to pick up.
The first Rickenbacker design, I would say roughly akin to the types of automobiles that were available then. It was rather large, it was rather solid, rather well built, actually rather clunky in my opinion. It was a monster instrument. However, it sounded like no other instrument. And those initial, the initial voicing on that instrument carried through in the subsequent redesigns of the instrument, which by the time of Chris Squire meant that it was entirely distinctive. And someone with the power and the creativity of Chris Squire was able to utilize that sound to great benefit, to move the bass from the back of the sound to right up front and center stage.
I think it was in 1972 or 3, Rolling Stone ran an article, Sound Wizards to the Grateful Dead. Some of what was going on at that point was that musicians were taking control of the recording studios. We'd be in the control room and we'd say, well, what does that do? And the engineers would blanch and we'd find out what it did. Or what happens if you take that compressor and plug it into that one? Well, they hadn't even thought of that, much less done it. So musicians started experimenting with this very expensive recording gear. That was going on the East Coast. It was also going on the West Coast. Out of that, we all sort of collectively discovered that the technology of electric instruments was pretty far behind the curve. Typical pickups for basses and guitars had very limited frequency response. The PA systems were not up to where the recording gear of that time was, and there was an intense desire to figure out how to make it better. Gradually, the instrument modification and the instrument building took over as being the primary focus of Alembic.
The goal was to make it a neutral sounding instrument, so that subtleties of expression through the artist's fingers would be reproduced, so that the instrument didn't color everything. We saw the work that Rickenbacker had done with the through body neck and incorporated that into the first instruments that we actually started building from scratch. And then also added mass under the bridge, added a block of material to provide a grounding for a grounding in the sense of physics or motion, not an electrical ground, but grounding for the energy so that it would be reflected back in the string and not lost in the body. These were goals to minimize the effect of the body of the instrument, the wood of the instrument, again making the instrument more neutral, more high fidelity, if you would.
Alembic was the start of all these type of basses. I remember when I first got my Alembic and it came with a piece of paper that said it was made with 11 different woods, you know, Brazilian this and zebra wood and mahogany. And I was like, wow, you know. I mean, again, I'm 12 years old in the 7th grade. You know, I have a bass like Stanley Clarke, and then it's made out of all these different types of woods. It was beautiful. And nowadays, you see it all over the place, the 5-piece necks or the neck throughs and the great, you can choose the woods you want on the top. In my mind, until someone tells me different, that all came from alembic.
That was some very interesting work. He'd brought Bill Lawrence, the pickup designer, over from Germany, and they came up with a concept of slip-in interchangeable pickups for bass and guitar. And that was very, very innovative. Those instruments are still a pretty stunning example of innovative design work, using clear plexiglass for the body. They were very heavy, but they were quite beautiful. Together we developed the first graphite epoxy instrument necks, and I subsequently got a patent on that, and Jeff subsequently started a company called Modulus Graphite, which is still going today. And John McVie of Fleetwood Mac got the very first of the graphite necked basses, and Stanley Clarke got the second one.
I saw Tony Levin play the Steinberger fretless with Peter Gabriel, and that was the best tone I've ever heard in my entire life.